Hello and welcome to my garden. I've not really filmed out here much because it's normally quite cold and dreary because we live in the UK. But today it's actually a very nice day. You can see a bit of blue peeking through right there. But the green is greening, the sun is shining, and I thought, let's go outside to film this video. Hopefully I don't get attacked by many wasps today. Even though that's already happened twice since I started filming. Anyway, today I'm going to take you through a couple of books that I read back in April. My university set us a reading challenge for Refuge UK, which is a charity that supports women and children who have experienced domestic violence, which I think is a very noble cause, and there is a link in the description box below if you would like to go and donate. Whatever you can would be amazing. But yeah, so the university basically gave us a reading list of 46 books that we could read, and the challenge was to read as many as we could within the month of April. We have holidays in the month of April, so I managed to read a whopping 10 books. I was very proud of myself, but a lot of them were books that you just genuinely you can't put them down. So yeah, I thought I'd take you through. The list of 46 books will also be in the description box below. Should you choose to go and read any of them, let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any other recommendations. But yeah, let's go. So, the first book that I read for this challenge was Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Now, the reason I chose to start with this book was because in my mind, this is sort of essential reading when it comes to women's rights, oppression, things like that. And I actually went into this book not knowing much about it. I'd read a chapter, the first chapter, for English in school, like 5-6 years ago, so I didn't really know much about the book. I do know that there's also a TV show, but I did not watch the TV show. I may now, but I had not watched it prior to this point. I did listen to this book in audiobook form, which I feel like is important to say when discussing the show, because the actress who portrayed June, Elizabeth Moss, she actually narrates the audiobook and she does it perfectly. It's like I couldn't imagine a better person to be narrating this story than her. So would 100% recommend listening to the audiobook if you are looking to read this book but don't quite have enough time to pick it up as a physical copy, which is what I found, because at the beginning of April I was very busy with exams and stuff, so it just made sense, I think, in my mind to listen to it as an audiobook, and I would 100% recommend. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was confused when I first started reading this book or listening to this book, because I felt like I was lacking a lot of background information. I don't know if that was because I wasn't like fully into the book because of exams at the time, or if I just, I just wanted more background information. And I think as soon as I got that background information, and as soon as I sort of figured out what was going on, I was hooked. It sunk its metaphorical claws into me. There is another wasp coming. Where was I? Yeah, as soon as I got the background information that I wanted, I was completely and utterly hooked, and I think I finished the book in like 4 days, which is actually slow for this reading challenge, but very fast for me normally. Anyway, one thing that I really appreciated about this book was that the main character, June, is not a teenager. A lot of books I've read sort of in this dystopian genre, which in all fairness, I've read a lot of YA dystopian books more than like other kinds of dystopian books, but a lot of times the main character is a teenager, and I think the fact that June is an adult and she had a life before Gilead gives her character and the story so much more depth, because she's not just she's not discovering oppression for the first time. She's not trying to overthrow an evil she's known her entire life. She's mourning the life that she did have prior to Gilead, and she had she had a lot of life. She had a job, she had kids, or a kid, and a husband, and friends, and this, you know, regime, I guess you could call it. You could definitely call it a regime. This regime just takes it all away from her, and she has to mourn that, and, you know, not understand her place in this new life, because we, you know, start the story with her very much indoctrinated in it. But yeah, it's a different kind of, it's a different perspective, I guess, than a lot of the dystopian books that I've read in the past, which made it hit that much harder. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that you read it, even if it's just for that reason. I think the way that the story is framed at the end of the book, where these are audio tapes that June recorded and they've been found and they're being studied by academics in the future, just gives the story a whole different tone, and it just changes your perspective completely, because you realize that Gilead doesn't exist, and none of these women who are being wronged in this time period are going to get the vengeance that they deserve. It's not like a big battle at the end. It doesn't have that sort of climax and finality to it, that it ends and we know how it ends and everyone gets justice and things like that. We just know that June escaped, and she recorded these tapes that told the future of what she experienced as a woman who lived under this regime, and it just makes the ending that much more bittersweet in my mind. It's not as final as the bad guy died and everyone got the happy ending. It's, I guess, in much the way that a lot of historical events end, it's just over, and we have to learn from it and hopefully not make the same mistakes in the future. And that's it. There's no vengeance, there's no payouts to the victims, there's nothing like that. It's just the end, which is quite sad. But I think while the story is undeniably heavy, it's worth a read, and you should definitely read it at some point in your life. But I do understand that it is very heavy, and probably subconsciously that's the reason why I hadn't picked it up until now. But yeah, definitely did have to stare at my ceiling for a little bit after this book, because it hits hard. But I'm glad I finally read it. The next book I read was Winter Trees by Sylvia Plath, which is a poetry collection. Now, I hadn't picked up a poetry collection for quite a long time before I read this one. I think this was quite a heavy place to start back up, because knowing that this poetry collection was written in the last 9 months of her life gives it so much more weight. And I didn't know that, to be fair, when I started reading this collection, so I didn't have that context. But it's still such a sad and sort of devastating piece of literature. The themes of identity and loss and motherhood just run so deep in the poetry that it sort of brings you into her world of what those last months looked like for her, which just made it all the more devastating, to be perfectly honest. As my first foray into Plath's work, it was definitely a lot to get through, because I wasn't familiar with her style of writing. I think it's very much stream of consciousness writing, and I think that works quite well with her poetry. But I'd like to see how that translates into her other work. Spoiler alert, the next book I read is also her work, so yeah. I think Winter Trees was just dense with emotion and symbolism and pain, which obviously makes sense with the context. But as someone who didn't know that context, it translates just as well. In my opinion, The Three Women was my favorite poem. I think that it just stylistically was so interesting, and I'd love to see it performed, actually. I've heard that there's a radio performance of it from around that time, so if I can find a video of that, then I will definitely link it below. But I definitely think it merits a big grand performance, and I think someone should do that if they haven't already. Again, I don't know if people have. I may be very naive in saying that they haven't, but I think it definitely deserves that. So yeah. The next book I read was The Bell Jar, also by Sylvia Plath. Now, while I really enjoyed this book, I feel like it's prudent to touch on the more insensitive aspects of the book. Notably, or maybe less notably, Sylvia Plath had some controversial opinions about people of colour, and unfortunately that comes across quite a lot in this book. And you know, you could write it off as a product of the time, but actually the Bell Jar was published during the civil rights movement and generally a very progressive time frame. So I think the book just highlights how out of place her thoughts were and how not okay they were. And while the rest of the book does read very well, it is disappointing to see those remarks in a book that so many people rave about. The book, the book in and of itself is very, very good. It's a very raw description of what depression can look like, and I think it does a good job in dismantling the public persona that Plath had as sort of this woman, this incredible woman, and this amazing poet, and you know, all of those things. And actually this just strips her down into a very different kind of person, I think. And I think it's just a very beautiful description of what living with depression can look like. And I think it's a very important book to read, despite, you know, the more controversial aspects of it. I think it is a very beautiful book. And I think, you know, oh god, I think also the fig tree analogy, which I guess it was very popular on social media, you know, a couple years ago, I think it's a very interesting way to look at your life and what you can achieve and you have achieved, and how no matter what you achieve, that doesn't hide what's going on up here. The next book I read was Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. Now, this book I could rave about for days. I read it a year ago, actually, for the first time, and I didn't put it down. I read it in mere hours. The second time I read it even faster, because it's just so beautiful and well written, and it's devastating. I'm going to use that word a lot, I feel like, in these reviews, because a lot of these books are very sad, but this book killed me. Now, I think it takes a very brave person to write about the life of one of perhaps the greatest writer of all time, William Shakespeare, and yet this book is not about Shakespeare. It's about his wife, Anne Hathaway, or Agnes as she's known in the book, because we don't know what her real name was. And it takes you through two different timelines or two different parts of Agnes's life, the beginning of her life, and then this sort of few weeks span in her life, from her kid being fit as a fiddle and healthy to Hamlet dying of the bubonic plague, which then in turn inspired the writing of Hamlet, the play that we all know and love. And in all fairness, I didn't know much about Shakespeare's life. I knew that Hamlet was based off the death of his son Hamlet, but the way that Maggie O'Farrell tells the story is just so raw, and you feel like you're there. I felt like I was there and I was losing my kid. Not that I have any children, of course, but it just is so poignant, and it's hard to read. It grips you, and she's told the story so well that it's just devastating. Absolutely devastating. I will be buying this book and keeping it as a physical copy forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. The next book I read after the emotional bomb that was Hamnet was The Patriarchs by Angela Saini. Now, this book is the first non-fiction book that I read for this challenge, and actually I'd never heard of it before I got given the reading list for this challenge. But when I read the blurb, I was so intrigued because it just answers a lot of questions I think a lot of people have about the patriarchy. And I was actually very nervous before I started reading this book because I thought it would be sort of complex and difficult to digest in the same way that Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari is, because this book was compared to that book. But when I started reading it, I was happy to learn that I was actually very wrong in that assumption. This book is amazingly well written. I think what makes The Patriarch so compelling is the way that Angela Saini doesn't try to offer a single grand theory for how the patriarchy came to be. Instead, she travels across continents and through different eras, and she shows how power systems that we've labelled as patriarchal are actually in flux, and they're constantly being changed by local contexts and economic shifts and resistance movements. And it's made me very hungry for similar non-fiction literature. I just feel like I need to learn more. Like, I want to learn more about this. So if you have any recommendations, I'd love to hear them. Please leave them in the comments below. And I'd love for you to read this book and tell me how it made you feel. The next book I read was another poetry collection, and this time it's And Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. Now, Maya Angelou is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most inspirational women in the world. And in secondary school, we actually had to pick an inspirational woman to represent us as a house, and we picked Maya Angelou. And this poetry collection just shows you why she's so inspirational. I read the entire collection in one sitting, and it just felt like being taken on a deeply emotional journey. The collection is split into 3 parts, and each part just had its own merits, and it was just wonderful. And the poem And Still I Rise within and of itself is just incredible. But there's a clarity and an honesty to her writing that just feels both personal and also universal, and it's definitely a must-read collection. I think if you haven't read any of Maya Angelou's work, this is a good place to start. In fact, if you haven't read much poetry in your life, I think this is a good place to start because it just is so beautifully well written. And this collection doesn't just showcase her literary brilliance, it shows like her soul. I think it's a window to her soul. They say that the eyes are the window to the soul. No. And Still I Rise is the window to Maya Angelou's soul, I think. And it's a powerful reminder that her voice resonates with so many people still today. And, you know, this is the reason we chose her as our inspirational woman all those many, many years ago. I'm not that old, but it was a while ago. The next book I read was another non-fiction one. It's Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. This is the only book in this challenge that I actually personally own. I got given it a couple of years ago for my birthday, but I'd never sort of tackled the book because it is quite research heavy and dense with sort of statistics, which is very important to read, but I think it's not necessarily a book that I would pick up for fun at first glance. However, I will say, despite it being so research heavy and packed with information, it is surprisingly accessible in its writing. And what struck me the most about this book was how much the world isn't geared towards women and how much it's structured around the male experience. From urban planning and healthcare to economic policy and even peace negotiations, which is kind of crazy. The gender data gap is everywhere, and it's very eye-opening, and it is infuriating, I will say, to read, and I sort of had to put it down a couple of times to be like, you know. But yeah, I appreciate that this book tries to include perspectives beyond the European experience, because I think that's often lacking in terms of data in these kinds of situations. That said, I do feel like there were some generalizations made, and the section on biology in the book lacked some depth. But then again, I'm a biomed student and this is kind of my shtick, so maybe that was why my thoughts were coloured on it. But I definitely think as an introduction to the systematic erasure of women in data and decision making, it's a decent read. It's a very decent read. And by decent, I mean it's very, very good, and you should 100% read it. You should 100% read all of these books. But if you're looking to understand the gap, the gender gap in a lot of different things, then I think this book is definitely very accessible and you should 100% read it. The next book I read was Homebody by Rupi Kaur. Now, I read a lot of Rupi Kaur's collections as a kid, you know, in that sort of time period of instant poetry, and this just takes me back to that time, but also as an adult, because I think this book is heavy. There's 4 chapters to this book: Mind, Heart, Rest and Wake, and I think all of them are equally as beautiful. That being said, I preferred Rest and Wake because they just feel grounding. Oh my god, that was a bumblebee, but it scared the living crap out of me. My favourite parts were Rest and Awake because they just felt very grounding and healing. And I do love Rupi Kaur's work as a South Asian woman, and I think she touches on things in a way that I can relate to because it's also my experiences. But also I think that they're very accessible in the way that she works them. They're not complex and difficult. I think what Homebody and the next book I read have in common is that they remind you that healing isn't linear, but it is possible. It's always possible. And I think that's an important message when thinking about, you know, the reason that I'm reading all these books is in support of women and children who've experienced domestic violence, and I think that's a very important thing to remember no matter what your situation is. But yes, that being said, the next book I read was What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. I cannot tell you how happy I am that I coincidentally chose to read this book last, because it is incredible. My university library, which is where I borrowed most of these books from, they got this book in especially for this challenge, and I'm so glad that they did. This book is such an interesting read. It's another non-fiction book. It's a memoir, and it's just incredibly well written. Stephanie Fu takes a journalistic approach to her own experiences and her own healing in a way that I've never read before. And you know, it's just such a good book, and this is a book where I would 100% tell everyone to read it. I think it felt very full circle ending with this book, because I started with The Handmaid's Tale, which is a story about women's oppression, and this book is a story, it's a memoir about healing, but it's also stories and interviews with professionals and things like that just make it so packed with information in a way that it's just a testament to her survival and her growth and her bravery that she wrote this book in the way that she did. And 100% recommend, 10 out of 10 read, 5 stars, all of it, just incredible. And yeah, that is the 10th book that I read. If you would like to read more of my reviews, if you enjoyed this one, I know this is very rambly and the sun has come and gone multiple times while I've been recording this. If you would like to read more of my reviews, then I will leave a link in the description box below. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope you have an incredible rest of your day, and yeah, I will catch you next time with another one. Goodbye.